the godless country. If one looks at the modern Western world through the eyes of Christianity, one sees what amounts to a neo-pagan rebellion against God, ripping and tearing at nature without regard for future generations, concentrating its genius upon the exploration of the outer world whilst neglecting or even scorning its own tradition of spiritual genius, indulging in every conceivable form of sensuality like a brute beast without a spirit. So wrote Anglican divine Bruce Wilson in 1983 in his book, Can God Survive in Australia? Since 1983, Australia has changed both for the better and for the worse. But many would say Wilson has been proved right, that Australia was entering a post-Christian age in which it neglects or even scorns its rich Christian heritage. Since then, secularisation has continued apace. Consumerism, technologies and the media dominate, and alternative sources of meaning and moral authority are on offer to rival the churches. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse drew attention to the terrible harm done to many young people, especially by clergy, religious or church workers in the 1960s, 70s and early 80s, and to the disastrous failure of some leaders to respond appropriately. By the 1990s, the Church was cleaning up its act, putting in place child protection strategies and redress schemes. But there was still much to learn. Though many of the Royal Commission's recommendations have already been embraced, the credibility of the Church and trust in its leaders have been seriously damaged. There is demoralisation, anger, or cynicism amongst many in the community, including amongst the faithful. Against such a background, it's hardly surprising the churches have experienced decline. Last year, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported that, while as recently as 1966, 9 out of 10 Australians described themselves as Christians, now only 6 out of 10 do. That 30% now say they have no religion, including 2 out of 5 young adults. I'll return to those statistics later, but they verify other signs of the declining influence of faith and religious institutions in this country. Other recent examples include the unrelentingly negative reporting about the churches, especially the Catholic Church, in some media, the treatment they received in some government inquiries, the exclusion of the Catholic Church from education funding negotiations last year and initial negotiations regarding the National Redress Scheme this year, the intent of government to widen the gap between the funding attracted by the average state school student and by the average Catholic school student, the numerous assaults on religious liberty detailed in submissions to the recent Ruddock inquiry, moves in some jurisdictions to reduce the few existing protections of freedom of thought, conscience and religion, pushes to deny churches their institutions charity status, government grants, eligibility to tender for government contracts. Challenges to Christian understandings of the human person, life and love, in laws and policies, mainstreaming abortion, euthanasia, same-sex marriage and gender ideology, and denying rights to health professionals and other dissenters. And the negative reactions many believers experience in the workplace, social, even familial settings when they stand up for their faith. In the face of declining influence and open hostility, the Church today can seem as forsaken as the children of Israel in chapter 2 of the book of the prophet Hosea. Thus says the Lord, "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for I no longer consider her my wife. For her unfaithfulness I will strip her naked, as bare as on the day she was born. I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land. I will hide my love from her children, because their mother conceived them in disgrace. I will block her path with thorn bushes, wall her in so she can find no way out. I will take away the silver and gold I lavished on her, the wool and linen with which I vested her. Thus will I expose her lewdness and put an end to her celebrations." Three Australian religiosities. There are lots of reasons to call contemporary Australia a godless country. Some would say it was always so. Yet the father of Australian history, Manning Clark, famously conceived the Chronicle of Australia as the interplay of three great faiths: Protestantism, the Enlightenment, and Catholicism. Though much criticised for giving religion such a prominent role, Clark insisted that from its very foundations, the three faiths coexisted in Australia as strangers, rivals, or sometimes allies, each contributing something to the evolution of Australian society. In this year's Scholarship at the Cathedral series, I want to propose a parallel hermeneutic by which we might understand not just Australia's spiritual cultural history, but her present spiritual crisis. And I suggest that there have been three strands of religiosity present in Australian culture or cultures from colonial times to the present: pre-Christian, Christian, and post-Christian. Like Clark's trio, these three religiosities have all touched individuals or communities, whether as inspiration or stranger, ally or rival. To think of Australia as simply pagan, or simply secular, or simply Christian is seriously to misunderstand our past and present. How to characterise the post-Christian strand in Australian culture, on which I will focus tonight. An obvious answer would be to say it is a worldview in which God, or the Christian God at least, has no real purchase on ordinary people's lives and on the institutions of cultural influence. But that might be true of some pre-Christian souls and societies too. Just as Protestantism is essentially a protest movement within and then against Catholicism, so post-Christianity is defined essentially by its continued relation to the Christian understandings that it both presumes and contests. On this interpretation of the term, something which is post-Christian owes an especial debt to, and is in conflict with, the Christianity that was temporally and logically prior to it. Like a sulky adolescent, post-Christianity is determined to be nothing like its parent. And you might say doomed also to be just like its parent. It might seem strange to include agnostic or atheist secularism amongst the prominent religious influences in Australia, given that it is a protest against religion. Yet secularism has so many experiential, ritualistic, doctrinal, moral and cultural features in common with pre-Christianity and Christianity that many sociologists, with good cause I think, count it as a religious phenomenon. 3. Aussie secularity. In his book, The Forge of Christendom, Tom Holland describes the West around the year 1000, with its caliphs and kings, knights and raiders, cathedrals and castles, slaughter and vendettas. He argues that it was the fateful meeting between Pope Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV that marked one of the most significant departures in history, as Western Europe emerged as a distinctive culture and expansionist power. The disappointment of millennial hopes and the settling of a much clearer separation between church and state was to give Christendom its particular energy and focus. Already 1,000 years old, the Christian understanding of church-state relations would continue to evolve and assume various hues in the subsequent millennium. In much of contemporary Western Europe, for instance, as in the communist East of the recent past, the tendency is to say, with respect to church and state, that ne'er the twain shall meet. Governments and courts increasingly marginalise believers and their institutions. Dogmatic secularists would ban Christmas decorations from public places, church bells from towers, crucifixes from schools or nurses' necks, veils from Muslim women's faces, and so on. No matter that religious believers are the majority and democracies are supposed to take majorities seriously. No matter that freedom of religion is a fundamental right and democracies are supposed to protect rights. Religion, on this version of secularity or laïcité, is presumed to be so benighted, intolerant, even violent, that it must be radically constrained and ultimately eradicated. If there are countries in which state or culture-imposed atheism is dominant, there are others in which religion seeks to dictate terms to government and society, including to people who do not share that faith, and to control every aspect of life. We think, for instance, of some Middle Eastern theocracies. While Holland and others contend that it was Christendom that first clearly distinguished the spheres of God and Caesar, even some Christian leaders have blurred those lines in pursuit of their own interests. American culture and society is a mix, I think, of both extremes, with lots of public religious rhetoric as if faith were compulsory, and bans on public prayers and cribs as if it were forbidden. For all its much vaunted religiosity and rights culture, the US government unashamedly ordered nuns to provide abortifacient coverage for their staff. Reflecting on the way things are sliding there, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago once provocatively predicted that he would die in his bed, his successor as Archbishop die in prison, and his successor die as a martyr in the public square. Here in Australia, we have a unique take on these things, I think. We distinguish between church and state and recognise that each has its own sphere of activity, goals, methods, actors. They mostly leave each other well enough alone. Where they intersect, church and state are sometimes rivals, but more often find ways to collaborate to their mutual advantage. For example, in education, healthcare, aged care, welfare. This live and let live, but don't wear religion on your sleeve, Aussie secularity, has mostly meant peaceful coexistence between people of all faiths and none, and allowed secular society to build on Christian social capital and vice versa. Its downsides are a certain intellectual laziness, practical atheism, and lack of vigilance regarding religious liberty, even amongst believers. Australian secularity has generally been more respectful than most versions of secularity, more respectful of both religious and democratic institutions. But today we encounter a more virulent secularism that would exclude faith and the faithful from public life, root out Judeo-Christian heritage from law and culture, and confine faith to an ever-narrowing field of private life. Believers are pressed to renounce their most deeply held beliefs, to stay silent about their dirty little secret, or else adopt a kind of dual personality. Absolutist post-Christianity resents its Christian heritage and is determined to end its influence. 4. Strange secular bedfellows. I've suggested tonight that pre-Christian, Christian and post-Christian religiosities have coexisted throughout Australian history, and at least until recently related in various creative ways, making their distinctive contributions, competing or joining forces for various projects, offering people choice, and tempering each other's enthusiasms. We might consider, for example, the state aid controversy. At first, the Australian colonies funded Protestant and even Catholic schools. But as secularism gained ascendancy, governments took to funding only state schools of an Anglican secularist character. Poor Catholic and rich grammar schools were left to their own devices. This proved very divisive and ultimately unsustainable. Under Menzies, Whitlam and Howard, a compromise was struck whereby state governments would largely fund the secular schools. The Commonwealth would ensure the sustainability of low-fee Catholic systemic schools, and both governments would make lesser contributions to high-fee private schools. The Defence of Government Schools lobby tried to block this measure, but the community was increasingly ashamed of the unequal treatment of Catholic students. The new arrangement meant the Catholic system would continue to relieve the state of significant financial burden in education, but would now receive much-needed assistance with teacher salaries. A long-standing grievance was corrected, and for nearly half a century, all three education sectors flourished. But there are signs that that historic settlement is unravelling. Traditional secularity was supposed to have vanquished sectarianism by instilling religious indifference and social tolerance in its stead. But dogmatic secularism has come to a new accommodation with old-fashioned sectarianism against their common foe, Catholicism. This was evident in the recent schools funding debate. The former Chief Justice of New South Wales, James Spiegelman, himself a Jew, once observed that anti-Catholicism is the last respectable variant of anti-Semitism in Australia. Catholics need not apply, may no longer be included in job ads, but it may increasingly be the subtext of government tenders and grants, big business behaviour, law and policy making, university programs, or media commentary. If secularism and sectarianism can make a toxic cocktail, so can other mixes with post-Christianity. In The Future Church, John Allen suggested that changing gender roles and hierarchies, demographic and technological change, globalisation and ecology present bigger challenges to the Church today even than secularisation. But when such forces join with secularism, they can magnify the influence of post-Christianity in contemporary culture. Secular modernity has brought in its train affluence, security, opportunity, respect. But it has replaced Christian conscience with narcissism, identity politics, political correctness, and the faux outrage of trolls and hashtaggers. The loss of the sacred plays out in marital and family breakdown, rising mental health issues, addiction to drugs, porn, apps, and other reality substitutes, loss of identity and community, moral confusion about sex, life, and much else. We could easily spend an evening considering the costs of a diminished sense of the transcendent. Even within the Christian community, secularisation plays out in various ways, such as declining Sunday worship, baptisms, confessions, church weddings and funerals, the diffidence of many pastors, teachers and faithful in proposing church teaching to the world, the distractedness and non-commitment of many when it comes to religious faith and worship, the internal cultures, staffing and behaviours of church agencies, sometimes indistinguishable from those of secular NGOs, fewer people embracing or sustaining vocations to marriage, as well as to religious life and priesthood, and declining participation in Catholic schools and organisations. 5. Secular inevitability? Much of what I've said tonight suggests Australia is indeed becoming a godless country, even if I've nuanced that claim in some ways. Yet I've suggested that there is more than one strand of religiosity plaited together in this country, and in subsequent lectures I'll explore 2 other strands in our spiritual history and contemporary life that might point in other directions. I promised to return to the 2016 census, especially its finding that in my lifetime, the proportion of Australians who ascribe to no religion has gone from 1 in 100 to 1 in 3. Before we get too gloomy about that, I'd note three things. One, that the Independent Assurance Panel on the census was unsure whether the rise in nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, not religious sisters, reflects changes in society and culture, or merely the change in the way the census question was asked. This time, no religion was put as the first option. Secondly, the atheist lobby cleverly campaigned that people who don't belong to a particular church community or don't regularly attend should mark no religion. Though disconnection from church does not necessarily mean all belief has evaporated. And thirdly, the ABS concludes that Australia remains a predominantly religious country, with 60% reporting a particular religious affiliation, and that Christianity remains by far the most common religion, 52% out of that 60%, the next biggest being Islam at 2.6% and Buddhism at 2.4%. Secularisation theory asserts that religion inevitably declines as individuals and communities modernise. But is that true? With Peter Berger, David Martin, Rodney Stark and others, I would argue it is not. And let me offer, and we're getting towards the end, 5 reasons for that claim tonight. As 19th century European societies modernised in economy and technology, Marxist, Nietzschean, Darwinian and other post-Christian thinking thrived, coming to a terrible climax in 20th century totalitarianisms. Yet those same societies became, if anything, more religious as the 19th century went on. 19th century, it's the ghost of John B. Paulding. 19th century Australia, on the other hand, while presumably less modern, was no more religious than 21st century Australia. Paulding made many of the same plaintive cries that the bishops make today, and practicing rates in Australia were about the same as they are today. As Richard Reimartz has pointed out, it's a mistake to see the past as a golden age where rates of religious practice and affiliation were much higher. The remarkably high rate of religious participation by Catholics in Australia and elsewhere in the immediate post-war era can be explained as an unusual confluence of factors which made religious affiliation attractive, including conflict with the surrounding culture, strong metaphysical compensation, internal social cohesion, and high birth rates. Historically, this situation in the 1950s was not typical. Secondly, global religious belief and practice are actually increasing as the world modernises. Secularising societies are bucking against the world trend. The Washington-based Pew Research Centre reports that religion is on the rise in all countries with a growing population and on the decline in all countries that are shrinking. Though 1 in 6 of the world's people now has no religious affiliation, by 2060, that will have shrunk to 1 in 8. Put baldly, agnosticism and atheism are in greater danger of extinction than Christianity. Religion-blind commentators serve us very poorly in understanding the contemporary world, especially Africa, the Middle East, Asia and South America, as well as mainstream and migrant Australia. Their gaping incomprehension at West Sydney's, indeed much of Sydney's, no vote last year is a good example. A third reason for doubting the inevitability of secularisation is the proven resilience of Christianity. Religious affiliation and fervour have waxed and waned over the centuries. But each time the death of God and end of Christianity have been proclaimed, a massive revival has been just around the corner. Revolutionary and Napoleonic France seemed to have lethally wounded the Church. Yet this released spiritual and missionary energies unseen in centuries. Soon new religious orders were evangelising the global south and building social infrastructure from which we still benefit today. Cardinal George famously predicted that his successor would die in prison and his successor die a martyr. But less well known is his next sentence. And his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the Church has done so often in human history. So pruning is not the end of the ecclesial vine or vineyard. It is often the prelude to more extraordinary fruit and harvest. A fourth reason to doubt secularisation theory is that while the Church in Australia can seem like forsaken Israel, a quarter of the nation still claim to be Catholics, despite all the pressures to disaffiliate, to disavow the Church on census or wherever. Many of them bring their faith and ideals to their public lives. The Church in Australia still boasts a peerless network of 1,400 parishes, 10,000 hospital beds, 20,000 aged care places, 45,000 tertiary education places, 700,000 school desks. Wave upon wave of faithful from every nation and tongue have made a truly Catholic Church here in Australia and been remarkably successful in raising themselves up even from the very bottom of the pile. 662,000 Catholic Australians still worship on Sunday, 98,000 of them in this archdiocese alone. Amidst many challenges, the Church in Australia still has many strengths on which to build. A fifth reason for doubting the inevitability of secularisation is that secularism is, in important respects, parasitic on religion, especially Christianity. In The Secular Conscience, Why Belief Belongs in Public Life, Austin Dacey, a self-confessed secularist, laments the marginalisation of religion in contemporary social discourse because of its crucial role in underpinning the secular liberal tradition, as well as being its foil. Unbelievers like himself, he argues, are challenged by Christians to secure a rationally informed and compassionate conscience. Thin liberal conceptions of the good, a la John Rawls and others, on the other hand, offer little basis for real choice or common life. In the end, individuals and societies go looking for a deeper wisdom. Which brings me to sixth and last, beyond the godless country. In a subsequent lecture in this series, I'll explore those alternative wisdoms that still inform much of Australian life and suggest our future may not be a post-Christian one at all. As Dean Hogue and others have argued, many who have gone cold on religion have not found anything better. Rather than being truly post-Christian, they profess a kind of Christianity light, and may yet be catalysed to return or to embrace for the first time a full-cream Catholicism. But as Pope Benedict observed, we cannot remedy the spiritual cultural maladies of modernity unless we first understand them. Hence my reflections tonight. Damp-proofing ourselves to bad secularisms and helping others recover their Christian commitment will require a better informed, more intelligent faith, more effective transmission of the Christian meta-narrative, the recovery of beautiful liturgy and affective devotional life, the cultivation of virtuous and saintly character, the witness of lives of justice and compassion, and the renewal of supportive communities of family, parish, school and polity. The project of re-sacralising secularised cultures, institutions and individuals is both daunting and truly exciting. Above all, we must, as individuals and communities, return to God and let His will, not ours, be done. Hosea's prophecy against unfaithful Israel did not end with her stripped, humiliated, and abandoned. It continued with a new and brighter future promised her. Thus says the Lord, I'm going to lure back my bride. In the wilderness I will speak tenderly to her. I will give her back her vineyards and make the valley a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth and again call me husband. I will remove the violence that surrounds her so that she may lie down in safety. I will betroth her to me forever in righteousness and justice, love and compassion. Amen.